Welcome to Viva MMA, a YouTube channel for shameless lovers of all things MMA.
Yeah, here we come. Hey, here we come. Hey, here we come. Here we come.
A couple of days ago, Philip DeFranco put up a video dealing with the Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor melee after UFC 229. For those of you who live under a UFC rock, after UFC 229, after Khabib savagely destroyed McGregor, Khabib jumped the octagon fence in order to confront Dennis, who is a training partner for McGregor, who apparently, although he denies it, was said to have been shouting slurs at Khabib during the fight. At the same time, apparently, based on some video footage, Conor took a swing at one of Khabib's coaches or something within the octagon, at which point two of Khabib's teammates jumped the fence into the octagon and sucker punched McGregor in the back of the head. But back it up a bit, this goes back to an incident in New York where McGregor confronted Khabib's team on a bus and threw a dolly through the window of the bus, and the glass shattered and cut Chiesa on the eye and injured Borg, and they had to withdraw from their upcoming fights. Now, where it gets interesting is the UFC is now deciding how to sanction the two Khabib teammates who jumped the fence to sucker punch Conor McGregor. Word on the street is that they might get kicked out of the UFC for life. Khabib on Instagram posted an ultimatum basically saying, you kick those guys out of the UFC, you can cancel my contract because I'm not coming back either. The treatment is unfair between what McGregor got and what is going to happen to my teammates. Now, I posted a comment on DeFranco's video and it became one of the most popular comments, and I'll read you that comment and I'll read you some of the responses to it. So, my comment was, McGregor's trash talk crossed the line of decency multiple times. Regardless of what else happens, I think Dana White UFC will issue protocols, limits on trash talking. There are limits to freedom of speech. I think there should be limits on the trash talking. Race, religion, national identity, sexual orientation, for example. It's entirely foreseeable that if you say certain things, even under the guise of, quote, trash talking, quote, it will lead to problems. If not only between the fighters, but between the fans as well, in my humble opinion. To which I got responses to the effect of, seriously, you think things through before speaking, yeah? You'd stop the most vital human right of the Western world over a UFC fight? Get real. Okay, let's just establish one thing. I was not promoting or being a proponent of limiting freedom of speech. And there's no but to that. In fact, the explanation is that the UFC is not a government institution looking to prohibit the freedom of speech of ordinary citizens. The UFC is a private enterprise which can, as most private enterprises do, have codes of conduct which provide for what is and what is not tolerated within the setting of the contracts which people sign in order to fight in the UFC. Anyone who thinks that what I'm promoting is violating the most fundamental right of freedom of speech, try going to your boss at work Monday morning and calling them fat, stupid, and ugly and saying that they have no business being your boss. Try to use freedom of speech as a defense to you getting fired. And that's the fundamental misunderstanding, is that a lot of people are confounding codes of conduct which limit what you can and can't say within a certain work setting with freedom of speech to say what you want to say with the consequences of exercising your freedom of speech. And this actually goes back to the NFL kneeling to protest the anthem business, where everyone is saying, you can't prohibit people's right to protest, it's a fundamental constitutional right. And you're right, but the Supreme Court has held that you can't protest at work if you have a code of conduct that prohibits protest at work. And the rationale is easy to understand. You can't have people showing up to protest at work and expect workplace to be functional and productive. It's not conceivable. Similarly, you can have restrictions on freedom of speech in a workplace environment so that you can have a civil and functional workplace environment. You can't just show up to work and start saying everything you believe under the guise of freedom of speech and expect not to get fired or reprimanded for it. So, I'm not promoting limiting freedom of speech. I am suggesting that even within the context of trash talking, the UFC could place some limits on what is fair game and what is not fair game. I do not think it's fair game, even in the context of trash talking to promote a fight, to attack someone's race, religion, sexual orientation, their spouses, their children. These are not things that promote a fight. These are things that take the fight well beyond the octagon. I mean, these are things that actually get people into violent confrontations outside of the octagon. So, I'm not promoting limiting freedom of speech. I am suggesting that there might be some reasonable limitations on what can and cannot be said, even within the context of promoting a fight. And for those of you who say that Dana White said that he's absolutely not going to place any limits on freedom of speech, times change. There was a time in the UFC when you could knee the head of a downed opponent. People saw the negative consequences that that had on the image of the sport and on the effect it had on the fighters, and they eventually changed what was permitted back in the day, back in the heyday, back in the greatest days of the UFC, as far as I'm concerned. I'm just joking. So seeing that it's permitted now and Dana White says nobody's going to change that, the times they are a-changing. And the time may come where what was permitted today is not going to be permitted in a year, the same way kneeing the head of a downed opponent was permitted 25 years ago and it's not permitted today. Other comments that I got were to the effect of, I'll read one right now. It's also noteworthy that there are fighters fired from the UFC due to their criminal actions outside of the octagon. Fighters like Thiago Silva and Will Chope got fired. While I agree with Silva's dismissal, I thought Chope's was a bit unfair. He was fired for an assault charge against him 5 years prior. A couple of years later, Dana White gives Greg Hardy, a former NFL player who also had an assault conviction and was arrested for cocaine possession, an opportunity to earn a UFC contract. It seems that the UFC flip-flops on their disciplinary policies, so I don't know what happens next, but one thing's for sure, they're gonna do it for the money. So, I happen to agree with that comment in the sense that inconsistent application of the rules necessarily lends for hard feelings and feelings of discrimination. When someone doesn't get the hammer brought down on them for doing something which is sufficiently similar to someone else who gets the hammer brought down on them for it, it can lend you to question why one person gets off and the other one doesn't. Some people will go with discrimination, some people can go with race, nationality, religion, others might just say it's the almighty buck that decides, and it could be a combination of both answers. There is a problem when the rules are not applied equally in equal situations. Now, other people are saying throwing a dolly at a bus, shattering the glass, injuring two fighters, Borg and Chiesa, possibly killing somebody or severely injuring somebody is much more serious than jumping the fence and sucker punching someone in the back of the head. And if McGregor got virtually no sanctions from the UFC for his chicanery, then Khabib and his team should get nothing either. There's a big distinction in this. There's a big fundamental distinction. What fighters do outside of the octagon does not necessarily reflect on what the fighter does inside the octagon. A fighter outside the octagon can be totally dysfunctional, but respect the rules inside the octagon. And this is the fundamental thing. A fighter can sucker punch someone outside of the octagon, and it is not as bad as sucker punching a fighter after the bell in the octagon. And even though they're equal things in principle, the fundamental difference is that one occurs outside of the octagon and one occurs inside the octagon. The sucker punch after the bell occurring inside the octagon violates the most fundamental principle that if a fighter does not stop fighting with certainty when the final bell has rung, that is a problem. That is a problem for a number of reasons. It's a safety issue for every fighter in the octagon. It's a potentially catastrophic issue for the ability to even hold events. When a city is deciding to issue a permit for a fight, they're not necessarily going to check the criminal records of all the fighters, but they are going to check whether or not there are riots, sucker punches at the event after the final bell is rung in determining whether or not they're going to hold one of these events in their cities. McGregor, having committed a crime outside the octagon, is not necessarily going to be a consideration for the city when deciding whether or not to issue permits for the fight. The fact that after the bell, a fighter sucker punches another fighter, all hell breaks loose at the fight, people start rioting in the crowd, the entire city's police force is called down to quell the rioting, that is going to be a determining factor in whether or not a city issues a permit for the fight in the first place. Sucker punching someone outside of the octagon does not necessarily kill the sport. Sucker punching someone after the bell within the octagon, leading to riots within the crowd, that potentially kills the sport. The ability to even hold events. What's Khabib going to do with the ultimatum? I don't know. It's a very dangerous thing to issue ultimatums because it makes it very difficult to come back on the ultimatum without losing face. I appreciate the loyalty of Khabib, but I do question whether or not the loyalty could be better served in a different manner. If his teammates get banned from the UFC and Khabib doesn't agree with it, keep fighting and take the money from the UFC, take your friends and go to Bellator. That's what Paul Daly did, and I'll go watch Paul Daly fight on Bellator, and I'm still holding it against the UFC that they banned Daly for life for sucker punching Koscheck after the fight. Vote with your dollar. Don't let a question of principle prohibit you from making money which you can then better use to go make the point that you want to make in the first place. Everybody's supporting Khabib's decision and taking a hard line and drawing a line in the sand. You know, everybody likes the sacrifice of others. I'm not sure that it's in Khabib's best interest to do this. Then it becomes a question as to what his best interest is. Is it making money? Is it abiding by a question of principle? Is it by making a point so that there's more consistent application of the rules within the UFC? There's a French expression, pourquoi mourir pour une cause? What is the expression? Pourquoi mourir pour une cause quand il y a autant? Something to the effect of, why die for one principle when there are so many others? Khabib can make his point without shooting himself in the foot and without cutting off his nose to spite his face. We'll see what happens with the ultimatum. We'll see if Dana White is going to take a chance losing Khabib by, in fact, banning the two fighters that jumped the octagon to sucker punch McGregor. One of the comments on Philip DeFranco's video was, there will be other fighters. And it's a decent point. There will be other fighters. There will be other golden goose fighters who bring in all the money. There will not be another league if this league goes under because nobody was able to control the fights and make sure that they stayed within the octagon and ended when the bell rang. That's it. Like, share, subscribe if you like anything I said. Spread the word. Let's build this channel up. Peace out and protect yourselves at all times.